Hi you guys, this is Miss Hall. This is your second video of the year and our topic is biomolecules. So last time on the first video it was a lot of talking about atoms. So this time we're going to talk about how atoms are put together to make molecules that are necessary for things to live. So again, from the last video, there are four main elements that are required for life: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. That's what makes up 96% of us, is just these four elements. That's it. So if we put them together, we get the molecules that are necessary for life. So our four main molecules we're going to talk about are carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and the biological word for this is lipids, and nucleic acids. And we're going to talk about each of them in detail. So just some information. We need food, and these carbs and these lipids, these proteins, I'm sure the first thing you think of when you think of those words is food. And we need these foods for certain things. We need food to not only build materials, like say you accidentally cut your skin or something. We need raw materials to repair those skin cells. But we also need food to help make energy, and the type of energy that we use in our bodies is called ATP. Okay? Water is super important. It makes up 65% of us, but the rest of us is made up of these carbon molecules. And the scientific word for anything that has carbon in it, or any molecule that has carbon in it, is called an organic molecule. So these four main biomolecules that are important for life, we can also call them organic molecules because they have carbon. So let's talk pretty quickly about how we make these molecules, so actually assembling them. All of these molecules are made up of small subunits. So we're starting with single building blocks. They're called monomers. So here's a monomer right here, some sort of molecule. Start making chains, add them together, make even longer chains. So once we get really long chains, then we're talking about making polymers. So big molecules are built from little molecules. All of these biomolecules that we talk about today are made of these monomers. So the big molecule is called the polymer. Okay, here's another example. Each of these diamonds is a monomer. Put them together into a chain and you get a polymer. Okay, here's an example of our biomolecules. Carbohydrate is a polymer, and it is made of a monomer called sugar. There's different types of sugars that we'll talk about, but basically carbs are just chains of sugar put together. Proteins, their monomer is called amino acid. So you put a chain of amino acids together, you get a protein. And then nucleic acids are, you guys have heard of DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So nucleic acids are just your genetic information. Those are built from a thing called nucleotides. Put a chain of nucleotides together and you get a nucleic acid. So we're building things, that's all we're doing. Okay, so this thing called synthesis happens that helps us build our large molecules. And as I said before, it's important for things like repairing torn tissues, or just growing in general, or reproduction, producing cells. We need raw materials to build these new things. Kind of like you need building supplies, wood and things to build a house. And it all takes energy to happen. So here's how it happens. It's this long word called dehydration synthesis. So synthesis means to build or to make something. So when we're making these polymer chains, it actually has to do with water. So if you look at this monomer on the right, it has a OH attached to the left side of it. This other side of the chain, this other monomer, has a hydrogen. Well, what happens is an enzyme comes and removes this H and HO and takes it out and produces a water. So now where those just were, they can bond to each other and make a bond. But it requires an enzyme, which we'll talk about more, but enzymes basically just make reactions happen. Okay. On the other hand, if we wanted to take these molecules apart, it's called digestion. So we take our polymer and break it back into its monomer subunits. And this is a super important process because this is how we can get energy out of these molecules, or ATP. So in digestion, we have to, this time instead of producing water, it's the reverse of the dehydration synthesis. It's called hydrolysis. Hydro means water, and lysis means to split open or to break. So we're going to use this water, we're going to add it into where this bond was and do the reverse of the dehydration synthesis. We're going to put the OH back on this side of the monomer and the hydrogen on this monomer and to split it apart. And again, this takes an enzyme to make it happen. All chemical reactions require an enzyme. Okay, and this releases a bunch of energy. I forgot to mention, in each of these stored bonds in a molecule, that is basically stored energy. So anytime you break a bond in a molecule, you release a bunch of energy, which is good because we need the energy to use in other processes. Here's an example of digestion. This is a large complex molecule called starch, which I'm sure you've all eaten before. But if you wanted to, when you eat starch, you have to, there's so much energy stored in it that our body has to break it down using the hydrolysis to get it into its monomers. We'll get the subunits so that we can use these molecules for other things in our body, but most importantly, we get the ATP out of it, the energy. And the starch will be broken down into a sugar called glucose. And there's our ATP. Okay. And here's an example of synthesis. I'll talk about this again. It's later in your notes. Well, I already talked about it. Amino acids, when you put a chain of amino acids together, it makes a protein. Muscle, that's protein. Okay, all right. Oop, that guy just fell over. All right, next one. Okay, so now we're going to talk about carbohydrates in more detail. Look at all those yummy carbohydrates. All right. Carbohydrates are basically energy molecules. Their main function is to give you quick energy. Okay, the building block molecules, and another word for this, remember, is monomer, which I think is what it says on your questions. The monomer of carbohydrates are sugars, and they're different types of sugars, but it's basically just a chain of sugars all put together, a really long chain. Here's some more functions. The main function of carbohydrates is to get quick energy. But you can also store some of the energy. You can store it in these bonds of the molecules. It also provides structure in cell walls in plants. It's this special stuff called cellulose that's found in the cell wall. It makes plants and their stems very rigid so that they don't fall over and they can stay standing up. Okay. When you see anything ending in OSE, ose, then that means that it is a sugar. So glucose, fructose, sucrose, those are all examples of different sugars used for different things. Like fructose is typically found in fruit. Sucrose is your typical table sugar that everyone eats. And when we're building carbohydrates, we can have different numbers of chains put together. So say you just have one single glucose molecule. Another word we can call that is monosaccharide. The prefix mono means one, and saccharide actually means sugar. So this means one sugar. Well, if we take one glucose and another glucose and put them together by dehydration synthesis, then we can get a disaccharide. Di means two, saccharide means sugar. So this is a disaccharide. So maltose is actually a disaccharide. It's made up of two glucose molecules put together. And that's what you put in beer. Okay. Here's another example. Say this time we take a glucose molecule and instead of putting it with another glucose molecule, we put it with fructose. You get a different disaccharide. It's called sucrose. So that table sugar that everyone eats when, I don't know, whatever you're cooking or in chocolates, it's made up of glucose and fructose monomers to make this disaccharide. Little penguin guy. Okay, then those were just disaccharides. Then we have really big carbohydrates. They're called polysaccharides. The prefix poly means many. So this is many sugars put together to make really long chains of things. The two examples of large carbohydrates, there's starch. Starch, you eat this, it's in breads and potatoes. It's just the way that plants store energy. So think of a potato, that's all starch, it's all energy. And then there's this thing called glycogen. We have to store, and I say we because we are animals as humans, we have to store our energy a little bit differently, and we store it in the form of glycogen. And that's mainly stored in muscles. And then I mentioned this already too, there's this thing called cellulose. Cellulose is what keeps plants so rigid in their cell walls. And chitin, ooh, chitin's cool. Have you ever stepped on a cockroach, or any bug for that matter, and you hear it go crunch? Or the arthropod is on there, like cracking a crab open or something? That stuff that makes it so rigid, or that stuff that goes crunch when you step on it, that's chitin. It's the exoskeleton. Okay, so here's the really long chains of the glucose molecules making polysaccharides, starch and glycogen again. And actually breaking this stuff down, starch is really easy for us to digest, but cellulose on the other hand is not. And the reason why is because since all these reactions need enzymes, we actually don't have the enzyme that can break these monomers apart. I'm going to skip kind of fast here. Most herbivores can digest it. They have the enzyme that can do it. Carnivores can't though, so it's typically why they eat meat to get their energy. But if you look at these two herbivores, actually cows can digest it and gorillas cannot. And this is why. Because cows have these special bacteria that are adapted to live in their stomach, and they produce the enzyme that can digest the cellulose. So without that enzyme, you can eat it still, it's just not going to be digested completely, which is good for your intestine system, and I'll just leave it at that. All right. Next, lipids. Lipids are fats and oils. They are concentrated energy molecules. Waxes is another example. And then something that you don't eat but are still lipids are hormones. So the sex hormones, it's testosterone in males, estrogen in females, the more concentrated. And the function of a lipid is primarily energy storage. Lipids are really large molecules. They have a lot of bonds. So remember, in those bonds is stored energy. It stores way more energy than carbs. But lipids are also found in the cell membrane. You need some fat in your body because it helps cushion organs so they don't rub against each other. It decreases some of the friction, and also insulates your body to keep you warm, like whale blubber. This is what a fat molecule looks like. It's basically a big fat molecule. It's not a chain like the carbohydrates were. It's really just comprised of these 4 subunits, the yellow boxes and the gray boxes. This is broken down into, oh man, sorry it wasn't on there. These are fatty acids, and this gray part is glycerol. So if you miss that, I can help you in class with that. Alright, and then the difference between the fats, they're saturated and unsaturated. I'm sure you've probably heard some, like one is better than the other. Saturated fats are not the good ones for you. Those are solid at room temperature. So think of like butter. Those are bad. Those are the ones that will get deposited in your arteries. The unsaturated fats, the oils, are the good, the liquid ones. And the reason why it's better is because in this picture of this lipid, it actually has this kink in the middle due to a double bond. And because of that, they won't lie flat in your arteries. Like if you imagine this in your artery, it would clog it really fast. This way you still have blood being able to get through your arteries. So unsaturated are the way to go. And other lipids, cholesterol is another example of a good molecule you need, but of course too many aren't going to be good for you. And you need hormones too. And the cell membrane, we're going to talk more about that later, so I'm going to kind of skip over this right now, but just know lipids make up the cell membrane as well. And I'm going to have to add another video, so stay tuned.